Welcome to Module 11 of the Works Clearinghouse WWC Group Design Standards Training. You can access all of the resources mentioned in this module through the WWC's website, whatworks.ed.gov. This module focuses on the WWC's procedures in the third phase in the review process, where the WWC synthesizes and reports two sets of results: a research rating based on the strength of the research design and its execution, and an effectiveness rating based on the evidence of favorable effects from the intervention. Some of this material may be familiar, as we have discussed it in previous modules. However, now that you are nearing the end of the WWC training, this module will tie together some of the concepts we have discussed. In this module, we will describe in detail how the WWC identifies eligible findings and distinguishes between main and supplemental findings. We will show how the WWC determines study-level research ratings based on the research ratings of individual study findings. And finally, we will discuss how the WWC determines effectiveness ratings to characterize study findings. Recall that the WWC's review process consists of the three general phases shown here. Prior modules in this training series covered the first two phases, which included screening studies for eligibility and reviewing study findings according to the WWC standards. In this third and final phase of the review process, the WWC will determine study-level research ratings for all studies that have been reviewed. And for any reviewed studies that meet standards, the WWC also will determine an effectiveness rating for each outcome domain in the study. Recall that research ratings focus on design-specific features to determine whether a study's findings can be attributed to the intervention. Effectiveness ratings focus on findings that meet the WWC's standards, the average effect size, and statistical significance, as well as whether the sample is large and multi-site. It is important to note that these two types of research ratings are independent of one another. For instance, a study might receive the highest research rating of meets WWC standards without reservations because it is a well-designed and executed study. However, that well-designed study still may report null or negative results of the intervention, which then may result in a low rating for the effectiveness of the intervention. In fact, including all high-quality evidence, even null or negative results, into our synthesis products is an intentional part of the review process. Let's begin by discussing how the WWC determines study-level research ratings. The WWC's synthesis and reporting of a study's results is based on the identification of eligible findings. The WWC defines a finding as the measured effect of the intervention relative to a specific comparison condition on an outcome for a sample at a certain point in time. WWC reviewers use the study review protocol to determine the study's eligible findings and the outcome domain to which they belong. A key consideration in the WWC's synthesis and reporting of a study's results is whether findings are designated as main or supplemental findings. Main findings must be reviewed as part of the study review, and main findings always contribute to WWC research and effectiveness ratings. Supplemental findings, on the other hand, are reviewed only if specified in the study review protocol, or if they are needed for the purpose of the review. For instance, if the focus of the review is on English language learners, then supplemental findings for a subgroup of English language learners would be reviewed. Supplemental findings also are reviewed if the findings are needed to construct a main finding in an outcome domain, which we will describe later in this module. Supplemental findings never contribute to research ratings, and instead the WWC reports supplemental findings in supplemental tables. However, for WWC synthesis products, such as intervention reports and practice guides, the team conducting the synthesis may use supplemental findings as main findings. When this occurs, the designation of a finding as main or supplemental in the underlying study review will remain unchanged. For example, if a synthesis product focused on English language learners includes subgroup findings for these students from individual studies, the team conducting the synthesis may choose to analyze such subgroup findings as main findings for the purpose of the synthesis. Any such decisions will be documented in the topic area synthesis protocol. So what types of findings does the WWC consider to be main findings? Main findings are based on eligible study findings that have the following characteristics. First, the finding is measured for the full analytic sample from the study, or if the study authors do not report findings for the full analytic sample, main findings can include subsamples that can be summed to equal the full analytic sample. If these types of subsamples are all available, the subsample findings contribute to a main finding, but are reported separately as supplemental findings. Review team leadership may allow findings for multiple student grade levels to count as multiple main findings without first needing to combine them as a single main finding. Main findings also must be measured as a composite as opposed to subscales. Main findings also must rely on independent measures if they fall within an outcome domain that requires independent measures, as specified in the study review protocol. Currently, domains where independent measures are of concern are related to math and literacy, but that could change in the future. Main findings also must be measured at the time period closest to the end of the intervention, unless they are in a domain for which the study review protocol specifies that they are to be measured at a later time period. Currently, exceptions to this rule apply to the employment, earnings, and educational attainment domains. Main findings also must be based on the more continuous version of a measure, when both a continuous and dichotomous version of the same outcome measure are available. And finally, main findings have an effect size that can be estimated, assuming the WWC has an acceptable computational approach for capturing an effect size for the research design. Again, main findings that meet these characteristics must be reviewed as part of the study review, and main findings always contribute to WWC research and effectiveness ratings. Supplemental findings, on the other hand, are only reviewed if specified in the study review protocol, or if they are needed for the purposes of the review. The WWC considers supplemental findings to be eligible study findings with the following characteristics. First, supplemental findings include findings for eligible subgroups of study participants who do not represent the full analytic sample, as articulated in the study review protocol. Findings for subgroups not identified in the study review protocol may be reviewed as needed for the purpose of the review. Supplemental findings also include findings from subscale scores as opposed to composite scores, assuming the composite score also was administered to participants. Supplemental findings include any findings relying on non-independent measures when the study review protocol requires those measures to be independent in order to contribute to main findings. Supplemental findings also include findings at additional time periods not represented in the main findings, such as interim time periods or additional follow-up time periods. Supplemental findings are also those based on dichotomized versions of a variable when both a continuous and dichotomized version of the same outcome are available. And supplemental findings include findings for which effect sizes cannot be computed due to a lack of available information, in the case that WWC has an acceptable computational approach available to calculate an effect size for that research design. Additional approaches are available to review team leadership when main findings are unavailable or unclear in a study. Chapter 7 of the WWC Procedures and Standards Handbook, or the Handbook, covers this scenario. If no main finding meets WWC standards in an outcome domain, the WWC still may report supplemental findings in that domain that meet WWC standards, either if required by the handbook or for the purpose of the study review. If main findings are unavailable or unclear, review team leadership may use one of the following approaches. First, if the study has no main findings for the full analytic sample, but the supplemental findings meet standards for non-overlapping subsamples that sum to the full sample, then, whenever possible, the WWC will pool those supplemental findings as the main finding and will report the corresponding subsample findings as supplemental findings. Second, if there is not a single comparison group for the study, but there are multiple possible comparison groups, then review team leadership may decide to create a pooled comparison group, and the WWC then will report the findings for each potential comparison group as supplemental findings. Third, when study authors report a set of sensitivity analyses that focus on the same or very similar samples, but they apply different analytic methods to obtain each finding, the WWC relies on the primary analysis identified by the study authors in their reporting of findings. The WWC generally will not review the remaining sensitivity analyses unless specifically needed for the purpose of the study review, but the WWC will note the existence of these additional analyses in the study review documentation. Fourth, if study authors report findings from both intent to treat and complier average causal effects analyses, the WWC usually will rely on findings from the intent to treat analysis to identify main findings. The choice may be based on the type of research question that review team leadership judges is of greatest interest to decision makers. As described throughout this training series, the WWC will assign one of 3 research ratings to each eligible main and supplemental finding in a study. The 3 possible research ratings for each eligible main and supplemental finding in a study are: meets WWC standards without reservations, meets WWC standards with reservations, and does not meet WWC standards. As discussed throughout this training series, these research ratings are based on how well the study met the group design standards related to outcomes, confounding factors, design execution, compositional change, baseline equivalence, and handling of missing data. So, the research rating is focused primarily on how well designed and executed the study was, rather than factors like the observed effect of the intervention, the number of participants, or how many locations were a part of the study. Remember also that findings from the same study can have different research ratings, so it is entirely possible for one study to have some findings that meet WWC standards and other findings that do not meet WWC standards. As we discussed earlier in this training series, after the WWC has assigned research ratings to each eligible main and supplemental study finding, the WWC will assign a study-level research rating. As shown in this table, the study-level research rating is equal to the highest rating given to any one of the main findings. So, if a study's highest-rated main finding is meets WWC standards without reservations, then the study-level research rating will be meets WWC standards without reservations. This rule applies even if the study has other findings that did not receive the highest research rating. If a study's highest-rated main finding is meets WWC standards with reservations, then the study-level research rating will be meets WWC standards with reservations. Again, this rule applies even if other findings from the study received a research rating of does not meet WWC standards. The study level research rating also will be meets WWC standards with reservations if a study only has supplemental findings that met standards, even if those supplemental findings had higher findings level research ratings. This reflects the WWC's concern about the study containing no main findings that met WWC standards. Finally, the study level research rating will be does not meet WWC standards if no main or supplemental findings met standards. In other words, if all reviewed findings received a research rating of does not meet WWC standards, then the study level research rating also will be does not meet WWC standards. Let's walk through an example to demonstrate this concept. Consider a study that had eligible findings in 4 outcome domains: Earth-Space Sciences, Life Sciences, Numbers and Operations, and Writing Quality. The findings for Life Sciences and Numbers and Operations were main findings, whereas the findings for Earth-Space Sciences and Writing Quality were supplemental findings. 2 of the findings did not meet standards, and 2 of the findings did meet standards. Because at least one main finding from the study is rated meets WWC standards without reservations, meaning the finding in the Numbers and Operations outcome domain, the study level research rating is also meets WWC standards without reservations. When the WWC reviews a study, additional information will be documented about that study, which will not affect the study's research rating. This includes information like the setting of the study, the demographic characteristics of the sample, features of the intervention and comparison groups, including whether there were any implementation issues in the study, and other details about how the intervention and comparison groups were formed. Although this information is collected during a study review, it is used to contextualize the findings from the study, but will not affect the study's study-level research rating. In addition, the WWC documents certain common issues that can affect how to interpret a study finding, including non-participation, contamination, and lack of fidelity. Again, these characteristics do not affect the study's research rating. Non-participation occurs when sample members assigned to the intervention group do not participate in the intervention. If not all sample members participated in the intervention, but those non-participants were still analyzed as part of the intervention group, then the intervention effect may be smaller than the effect that might have been obtained had all intervention group members participated. Contamination also can occur. Contamination refers to when sample members assigned to the comparison condition actually receive the intervention. This is sometimes referred to as a crossover. If these sample members provide outcome data and are analyzed as comparison group members, contamination can lead to a smaller finding. Finally, lack of fidelity occurs when components of the intervention are not implemented. Variations in implementation are to be expected in studies of interventions, because they take place in real-life settings and not necessarily under tightly controlled conditions monitored by researchers. If effective intervention components are omitted, findings might be smaller. If a study includes information related to any of these topics, again, reviewers will document this information during the review, and it may be included as context when describing the study and its findings in a WWC product. Again, the WWC documents this information, but it does not affect how the study is rated. In the next chapter of this module, we'll discuss how the WWC aggregates domain-level effect sizes within and across studies.